Hey, hey everybody, it's Tracy Brown from reclaimjoy.com, from diversitytrends.com, from the website What Is Mine to Do, and of course from Diversity Trends. Just saying that, it is as if I am multiple personalities, right? That I've got these different websites that may have attracted you into the session today. But for this particular topic, how to safely talk about race, what I'm finding is that there is an overlap between the different kinds of work that I do in the world, and I will talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So, in this session today, it really is about how to move away from the fear that might have been a part of your experience whenever the topic of race comes about or comes up. And at the time of this session, of course, race has been coming up a lot and a lot more frequently over the last couple of years. Definitely, race has been in our conversation within the United States and around the world in the last few weeks. And really, this topic has always been a part of diversity related training that I have facilitated, designed, or delivered. But it really came to a rise um, in the year following President Obama's election to office. And I think part of that was related to the fact that for so many years, for several decades, Americans were priding themselves on moving forward from where we were as a nation around this topic in the 1950s and 60s, let alone in the 1800s or the early 1900s. But after President Obama was elected, there were a lot of things that were written and said, and a lot of behaviors that started popping up on a more regular basis that made people realize that the work had resulted in progress, but there were still a lot of tensions and misunderstandings that had been just below the surface. And after President Obama's election, they rose above the surface, and people began behaving in ways that that were considered by many as disrespectful, let alone dangerous. So today we get to focus on how to stop being afraid to talk about the impact of race on our individual lives, as well as on the way that race relations, and racism impact our communities and our country. I'm going to give you some tips about what to say and probably a few things not to say or do. And all of this in the context of you wanting to build stronger relationships with people who are from different racial identity groups than your own. So, let me tell you a little bit about me because you may have been referred to this webinar by a friend, or you may not have been one of my clients. Just a couple of weeks ago, someone asked me, well, Tracy, how did you start learning about diversity, and what inspired you, or what training did you take to become an expert in this particular field? And I laughed because, to some degree, I feel my training began when I was 2 years old. And my family moved into a neighborhood that up until that point had been all white. And we were one of the first African American families to move into that area. And I didn't know it as a 2 year old, but I was already beginning to see what happens when people from different racial groups interact. And I'm really happy to say that there were no major traumas in this process. And it was really good for me to grow up in a neighborhood that was predominantly white at first, but by the time I was definitely by the time I was sixth or seventh grade, it was an almost all black neighborhood. So to see that transition, but to have been effective, to have white neighbors who, were very friendly until they moved out, but they were friendly to have that exposure, I think was part of laying the foundation that I knew I could interact with people from all different racial and ethnic groups. And then I did have some, negative experiences, whereas at 4 years old, being told that the reason I couldn't go into a white friend's home across the street was because her dad was concerned about what his parents would think, and they happened to be visiting. And this was someone who I played with all the time. But I never really realized we always played outside. And I also didn't realize, it's only in hindsight that I can remember that, oh, yeah, anytime they had any visitors at their house, you know, I couldn't go over. But, as a child, you just think, well, that makes sense. If we had family over or if we had friends over, I wouldn't be inviting the kids from the neighborhood in because we had company. And so it wasn't until, I got the information from her that her dad was concerned, his parents or her grandparents wouldn't want people like me in the house, and and having that conversation. And that's a hard conversation for a 4 or 5 year old, and you just understand it based on being 4 or 5. And then all through my life, I was part of some movement or some activity that had me be the one who was different, often by race, but not always. When I was in the fourth grade, I was bused across town to what had then been a predominantly white school and part of the desegregation movement, right? And that actually was probably the most traumatic. And I, you know, have a lot to say about that, but not right now. It's just part of what I experienced. And the good thing that came out of it was, while at the beginning of the year, there were adults and parents and protesters, waiting for the school bus every morning. But by the end of the year, that was not the case. At the beginning of the year, we pretty much were alone at recess or in the yard at recess time or lunchtime. But by the end of the year, that wasn't the case anymore. And so what I love is that I've had challenging experiences, but I've always been able to see the transition, the transformation that comes when you build that bridge. So it is no wonder that um, my life developed into a bridge building focus. And I have run a consulting firm that focuses on human and people issues in organizations, especially as it relates to the impact of diversity and inclusion, and creating the strategy that allows you to integrate diversity and inclusion into everything you do in your organization, but also on the personal development and spiritual development side. I am involved and engaged in bringing diversity and inclusion into spiritual communities and in helping individuals build the skills that are required to be effective in what I like to call a multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-generational world. So I'm going to take just about one more minute, give you a little summary of what Diversity Trends is all about, and then we'll jump right into content. So that's a little bit about diversity trends. And in that work, I feel so blessed because I get to talk about all the ways that we are different from one another. But today we're focusing specifically on race, racism, and race relations. And how do I, as an individual, have these conversations that actually help me understand what someone else's experience is as it has been impacted by race, especially race or ethnicity. And so, the first logical question is, why is understanding the impact of race important at all? So, what I have learned over the years is that most of the time we meet people and we are looking for our commonalities, right? We're looking for how we're the same. We almost assume that our life experience, it's our central point of reference. It's what we know. And so when we meet other people, we're often evaluating what they say and do based on what it would mean if I said or did that particular thing. One of the topics that many people grow up considering taboo is this topic of race. When we have young children with us and they notice a physical difference about someone, we shut them up. We tell them, shh, be quiet. Or we pull them close to us. And that teaches them non-verbally that they're not supposed to ask questions. They're not supposed to notice. We have this language of, as if it's a noble thing to be colorblind. And people grow up thinking, well, I'm not supposed to see color. Well, really, if you don't see color and you meet me, then you're not seeing me, because the color of my skin not only is the melanin showing up, but it colors my life experience. It doesn't totally define me. It's only one dimension of who I am. But in this particular case, it has a major impact on my experience of the world, how I view the world, and how the world views me. So pretending that we don't see it is a denial of the difference. And we do that culturally, not each of us individually, but as a culture, we've done that over many, 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 many decades because it's more comfortable, right? What we want to do is we want to avoid taking on the stereotype related to race or ethnicity, just like we want to avoid taking on the stereotype of any other way someone is different from us. But our culture has been so impacted by race, especially Black and white, that it's like in the air we breathe almost culturally, this dynamic. So we need to understand the impact of race so that we can have more authentic conversations with one another, so that we can have relationships that are built on the truth of who we are as Black people, as brown people, as white people, as every shade and hue in between. And when we fail to do that, when we pretend that it makes no difference, we only get a portion of that person's experience. In my first book, Breaking the Barrier of Bias, one of the stories that I share is a story about my friend Maya. And it is a story that I now smile about because we became really close friends and we are heart connected forever. But it didn't start out that way. Maya and I met doing community service. And, we ran into each other occasionally because we were both independent consultants and our paths would cross professionally as well. And one day Maya asked if we could go to lunch, that she wanted to talk about race, and she had some questions she wanted to ask me. And I will admit that at the time, in my mind, I was going, okay, here's another white person I have to educate. I'm tired of educating people and having them ask me a zillion questions, and then they don't change anything about their behavior. And it's like being interrogated for no good purpose. All of that was in my head from past experience. And so I said, sure, we can have lunch, but I didn't really respond, quickly to make that happen. And then I'd see Maya again. Maybe our paths would cross at a training development, ASTD meeting, or an HR meeting, or some community event, or we'd be volunteering at this particular agency. And she'd say again, I'd really like to have lunch. And then maybe she'd reach out to me, but the dates didn't work. So after about the third or fourth time this happened, I said, okay, Tracy, she keeps asking, just go ahead and do it. Get it over with, and, have the conversation, move on. And so we did. We confirmed a date, and we had lunch or met for coffee or something. And we were talking, and she had done a lot of work on her own. And she really was at that point of, I really just need to have an authentic conversation, someone who I can trust, and someone who will trust me, and we can, learn together. And it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful because she was doing her own work. And it wasn't just a curiosity. She wasn't asking me questions from a place of, my world is exactly as it should be, and let me see how I can fit you into it. And my heart was open by that conversation. And as I said, we became really, really good friends. Um, and it was a model for me, actually, of what I'm talking about today. How do you talk safely about this sensitive issue or topic that we know as race? And understanding the impact of race on the person you're talking to is critical if you want to understand who they are and what they experience in the world, who they really are and what they really experience in the world. Now, this is not just about someone who is Caucasian talking to someone who is African American. This is about any of us talking to anyone else, because actually, I have a lot of Black friends who have had a very different experience than my own. Generationally, people who are in my age group had a very different experience than my goddaughter's generation, those folks who are in their 20s right now. And so even within your own racial or ethnic group, everyone doesn't have the same experience. So developing the skill to be able to engage in these kinds of conversations really allows you to have more authentic relationships with everyone that you may come into contact with. So um, that's why understanding the impact of race is important. Now, if we were to elevate this conversation to the workplace, or, to our professional associations, to an organizational level, there is a bigger conversation to be had that relates both to recruitment and retention. And it also relates to customer service, marketing, sales, and community service. And actually do a webinar for corporate organizations that is specifically about taking it to that level, and having both the personal level that works on the team level, the personal ability to have these kinds of conversations one-on-one or in small groups with your department or team, but why this is also a really critical part of achieving inclusion in the workplace. But for today, we're kind of laser focused on the individual experience. If you and I are having a conversation, or if you want to have more powerful conversations with any individual, whether it's in your neighborhood, in your church, in your community, in your family, even. So, how do you initiate meaningful conversations about race and ethnicity? Well, there are a number of tips that I can give you here, but the first couple that come to mind are these. So, one is obvious. You want to invite someone to have the conversation with you, and you want to tell them what the conversation is about. You do not want to surprise them. You do not want to say, oh, come have lunch with me on Saturday. And then as soon as they sit down, dive into, I want you to tell me everything you know about race and race relations, because they'll feel blindsided. And, unless it's someone you've known for a really long time and they're accustomed to you digging into what they might see as a sensitive topic, then the surprise approach will not work. They'll be defensive and they will not react necessarily as authentically as they would like to. So invite, and my example with Maya is a great example of that. She invited me to have lunch with her to engage in a conversation about my experience as a Black woman in Dallas, Texas. And and so I knew what I was saying yes to. I knew this wasn't just a casual conversation, let me get to know you. Maybe we can work together, which is probably what I would have assumed, knowing that she too was an independent consultant as I was at the time. So, I meet with lots of people and we're looking for ways our work overlaps so that we might partner on a project or do some co-marketing of our businesses and services. So invite someone who you want to have the conversation with, but absolutely tell them what your goal is. And be okay if they say, well, no, not now. Related to that is also ask more than once if you're asking someone who you don't know very well, because they are likely to be skeptical, and they may be curious about why you're asking, but they may be skeptical, as I was of Maya, that you are truly wanting to have an honest conversation. And Um, and so that's one way to start. So how else can you initiate meaningful conversations about race and ethnicity? One of the most effective ways to do it is when there is something in the news that seems to either be divisive or just brings into the playing field, the topic of race or race relations or ethnicity. You can use that news story. It's hot in the media right now. And so you can use that to say, wow, maybe there are two or three people. And you might say, can we have a conversation about this? I really want to look beyond my own personal perception or my own personal opinion, and I want to hear different views about this. Or I want to hear how this that's going on is affecting other people beside myself. And that then gives you a common ground, right? Because everybody knows that this is happening in the world, and everybody is entitled to their own opinion or perception of what's going on, and maybe what are some of the precipitating factors and what should happen next. And so inviting people to engage with you around a hot topic, a current topic in the media, is actually the easiest way to open the door to these kinds of conversations. And a third way that you can initiate meaningful conversations about race and ethnicity is to just do some quick research in your own part of the country or the world and look for organizations that are discussing current events or that are focused on peace or social justice or intercultural relationships or intercultural communication. Now, I do have one caveat. There are a number of organizations that are focused on global or international relations. And while you can learn a lot, especially about diversity in general, what I have found, and this has just been my experience, when I go to those groups, I don't really find them open to or interested in engaging in conversations specifically about race, race relations, and racism in the US. So they're fabulous organizations, but typically they're focused more on US and cross-cultural with some other country or other countries, other nations. And most other countries don't have the same dynamic around race, racism, and relations as we have in the US. Now, there are countries that do have challenges, but again, they're not grounded in the same historical context. And so it becomes a challenge. So for this topic, normally I would say, oh, go to those groups. You're going to learn so much. It'll help you develop a broader perspective. And when I'm talking about the whole of diversity and inclusion, I absolutely support you doing that. But again, today we're focusing on this one lane, and that lane of race, racism, and race relations, especially in the US, and how do we safely talk about how that impacts our experiences in the world so that we can build really tight, really rewarding, really fulfilling relationships with people who are from a different group than our own. So, finding a group that is specifically talking about race or discrimination or social justice um, or peace within the U.S. Is those are your best bets to look for meetups or to find organizations that host regular meetings on these topics. So let me just think for a minute. Anything else that I want to say about initiating meaningful conversations? Yeah, maybe one more thing. Initiating meaningful conversations, I purposely use that word, initiating, meaning I'm the one who's reaching out. I'm the one who is going to invite others into this conversation. I do want to make a comment about responding to the invite. So someone else has invited you, and I was completely transparent with you that when Maya made that invitation to me, I was skeptical and hesitant. I have had other people make the invitation to me and I have jumped right in, like, okay, let's stop at what we're doing right now and talk about this. But I had a different relationship with them. And I've had people invite me into conversations where where it was a group. So it wasn't me just individually, and I knew it was going to be a group. And that has a slightly different dynamic. So trust your instinct and your intuition. If it's someone who you know well and you really feel you can be authentic, just dive right in. And if it's a group that you're not familiar with or a person you've never met before, you might be willing to have a different conversation. And there have been times when I have said to someone, well, that's a really, really sticky topic, or that's a really dangerous topic, how about we just meet and talk a little bit about our backgrounds first? And every time I've done that, that's been really fabulous. And since we know we're having a preliminary conversation before we dive deeply into the impact of race, we actually end up talking about it. But it just feels like we've jumped into the 3 foot end of the pool instead of the 6 foot, 9 foot, or 12 foot end of the pool. So take care of yourself in saying yes, but don't be afraid to dive in as you do that. So one of the guides that I use that is beyond just talking about race specifically is a summary of kind of 10 steps or 10 ideas and concepts that I always try to keep in mind when I'm having cross cultural conversations with people. And whether that, again, more than just race, but it absolutely applies when we are talking about race and race relations, because there are some things that you want to be aware of when you are having these conversations with people who absolutely just have a different background than your own. And so I have an ebook called Having Productive Cross-Cultural Conversations. And in that ebook, there are 10 tips for you. And I won't talk about all of them, but you can actually get the ebook on Kindle if it interests you, if you want to know more about um, any of these particular tips or things to keep in mind. Number one is no name calling. Number two is challenge behaviors, not beliefs, and really focus on what's happening in behavior versus what people are thinking or feeling. Listen for understanding, not agreement. And that's pretty self explanatory. That's most of the time we're listening to see if we agree with someone. But what if we were listening so that we could repeat what they said or represent their point from their point of view, even if we disagreed with it? Number four is asking questions that have no wrong answers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that one in a bit. Ask for specific feedback, not general feedback, but very specific behavioral feedback to find out if you are offending someone unintentionally just because you don't know that they're interpreting your behavior in a certain way. Use people first language, meaning we don't use an identity group as a noun, we use it as an adjective. So as we talk about race, we don't refer to, oh, I want to know what the blacks think, or I want to know what the Hispanics think. I might say, I'm really curious about what white people I know or what white people in this industry are thinking about this topic. I might say that it's really curious to me, um, something that's happened in the media, and it's a story about people who are Hispanic, but I won't say it's a story about the Hispanics. So people first language identifies that people are people and their identity group, whether it's race, ethnicity, age, disability, religion, that the identity group is just one facet of who the whole person is. Number seven is challenge your sense of superiority. And we often don't think of ourselves as superior, but we behave in a way that, again, says, my way must be the right way. And, your way is different in a way that's less than or not as effective. When really it might be just as effective for that other person that they do a certain thing a certain way. Number 8 is explain your belief or preference without requiring the other person to agree. And that allows you, yes, to be a little vulnerable, but it also models that you can hear their perspective without them expecting you to agree with them. Model vulnerability and provide safety. Disclose about yourself. If you're expecting whoever you're talking to disclose personal feelings and experiences, then you have to be willing to do that as well. And you really need to be able to ensure some confidentiality. And my number 10 tip in the cross-cultural conversations guide is to give yourself a learner's permit. And I'm only going to say one sentence about that. It's one of the things I talk about so much. But just remember, you're not the expert on diversity and inclusion most often. And even if you're like me and you actually are a recognized expert on the topic, I am not an expert on your experience. I'm not an expert on you. So I really have to listen and be willing to learn about your experience and your perceptions if I want to have a productive relationship with you. So those 10 tips in general help to make any cross-cultural conversation productive. And I use those when I'm designing workshops and when I'm creating a process to facilitate a group or individuals. I look at those 10 tips all the time to remind myself that there really are some guidelines that can help make it easier for us to talk with or build relationships with people who are very, very different from us. And I promised you that I would share 3 mistakes that are difficult to recover from because they really are difficult to recover from, and you're trying to build this relationship with someone and you do 1 or 2 or 3 of these things and you don't even realize that's why they're backing away from you or they're refusing to engage in further conversation with you. So I'm going to do a quick time check. Okay, we're doing good on time. Let me share these 3 major mistakes. And if you have already habitually made these 3 mistakes, you can begin setting new patterns today. Okay, so we can't change whatever's happened in the past, but we can begin a new beginning today, right? So the first one is from that list of 10 that you heard, the 10 guidelines. And I want to especially highlight this one as it relates to race because it happens way too often. And that is name calling. Now, of course, that you would not use things that are known racial slurs. You're not going to use the N word. You're not going to, use some of the inappropriate slurs for people of other racial and ethnic identity groups. However, what I have observed many times over is sometimes we don't realize a word is offensive because it's what family members have used always. It's especially when we're younger or if we've lived in one part of the country or state for a long time. And we may then go to another part of the country or another part of the state and not realize that that's an inappropriate or offensive word or phrase. So I, the only way you know that, right, is by the reaction you get. So pay attention to that. But in general, when I'm saying no name calling, I'm not talking about that because I make an assumption that if you are engaging in this kind of learning, you already know that and you've already made a commitment to learn as much as you can about known racial slurs or ethnic slurs. When I'm talking about here in this no name calling is really uh, in the topic of race, racism, and race relations, don't call someone a racist. Just don't even use the word. And why is that? Well, again, you're judging their behavior based on what you see and how you would label it. But in most cases, when people are telling a joke or they are responding or reacting to something that's happening politically, they're not intentionally being offensive. They may be saying, this is how I feel about it, and this is what I think. And for you then to automatically drop them into a negative label, it just cuts off any opportunity that you might have to truly build a relationship and understand where they're coming from, or have them listen to you. So you are not going to be able to influence them or inform them in any way. And you have just modeled for them that they can dismiss you and cut you off and just say, oh, well, she's that kind of person and I don't want to have anything to do with her. That doesn't describe productive relationship to me. And so, um, saying that someone is a racist, or yesterday even I heard someone was talking about someone else's response to something that had been in the news the day before, and they called him an idiot. Well, it's the same thing. They're coming from a different perspective. And any name calling is just inappropriate if you're trying to have a relationship or conversation with them, with someone. So no racist, no idiot. Actually, even using the Republican or Democratic Party or the Tea Party. Again, any name calling that says you're in this group and you're like everybody else cuts off your opportunity to build authentic relationship with that person. End of end of end of point, really, because of time. I just thought of two stories, but I don't have time for those right now. So second major mistake that's really difficult to recover from is really going after it after the conversation as a debate instead of a dialogue. So we all know a debate is about someone being a winner and someone being a loser. Debate is about you must prove to me that you're right and I'm wrong if you want me to change. Or my job in the debate is to prove to you that you're wrong and I'm right. And so it creates two warring sides. It establishes there must be a winner or a loser. And most of the time, our conversations are built around this concept of debate. Oh, that's what you think? Well, let me tell you what I think. And then you're at war with each other. It may be a subtle war, but that's what the foundation of the conversation is about. And so, what I encourage you to do instead is to take a dialogue approach to the conversation. That I just want to understand your position. I want to understand where you're coming from. I don't have to agree with it, but I want to understand it. And in such a way that I can actually articulate why you feel the way you do. And again, I don't have to agree with you, but that's what dialogue does. And the most recent example that really comes up for me is the conversations that have been happening about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And so, the many of the people who are believing and saying, Black Lives Matter, it's a call to action. I'm saying Black Lives Matter. Surely, clearly, in the United States of America, there has been a pattern that demonstrates that even though we say we're a nation of everyone being equal and everyone being valuable, we as a nation don't act that way. We can look at numerical outcomes in almost any measurable area of our lives and say that we don't really believe, if we look at the outcomes, they imply that we don't believe that Black lives matter. And not just in killing, or not just in the ratio of police shootings. In my opinion, that can show up in education. It shows up in home ownership. It shows up in all kinds of socioeconomic indicators. It shows up in the workplace. It shows up in a lot of indicators. And at the same time, because of my spiritual beliefs, I believe that all lives matter. So I can totally understand that every life is important, right? Every life has a divine source, that a creator that has created that life specifically for a purpose, and all lives matter. So for me, they're not an either or. They're making two different points. In the context of all lives matter, is there any data that there are certain groups that seem not to matter in the human experience? They all lives matter? And I would say yes. So if I focus on Black Lives Matter as a call to action, then that has its merit, and I'm not going to ignore that. And if I say all lives matter, that's okay. So as well. So what I've been watching happening is people aren't having that conversation. They're just saying Black lives matter. No, all lives matter. I'm not going to pull out Black people and support that Black lives matter. What? They matter more than a white life, or a brown life, or a pink life, or a purple life? No, it's not an either or. It's what's underneath the assumption. And if I can understand that and I can express it, then I have had a dialogue with you about where you're coming from, versus a debate about who's right and who's wrong. The third major mistake that's really difficult to recover from is dismissing another's experience or concern. How many times have you said or heard people say, "Oh, Tracy, she's just overreacting," or, "Oh, Tracy, there she goes again, pulling the race card. I don't, I'm not going to listen to her." When we dismiss someone's experience or their perception because of our inability to really understand it, it's really our unwillingness to understand it, then we can't recover from that, because that person is not going to come back to us and give us a fourth or fifth or sixth chance. Or that person feels the dismissal even if you did not say it to them, to their face. And so it's a mistake that's really hard to recover from, because you just can't take it back once you've told someone they are absolutely wrong, and it's about something that is their very existence. It's their experience every day. About a year and a half ago, there was a friend who was in a conversation, and she was in a conversation with a mixed race group, and they were talking about race. And this woman is a very accomplished teacher and musician, and she shared that when she had been in Whole Foods and the previous week, and every time she had been in Whole Foods, she'd been followed around by store security. And how interesting it was that she has money to spend, she eats healthily, she shops at Whole Foods on a regular basis, and she always gets followed, even though she goes to the same Whole Foods all the time. And there were a couple of white people in the group who basically said, "You're kidding. I can't believe that still happens. And, like, you look safe and responsible to me. Why would anybody follow you around?" And that was okay. They were curious and they were reacting, but they didn't make her wrong. And then there were a couple of people who said, "Oh, you're just exaggerating." And someone said, "Oh, they weren't following you because they thought you were going to steal something. They could have been following you for several reasons. And then one person even went so far as to say, are you sure somebody was following you? Maybe because you were just looking for somebody to follow you, you just imagined this person was following you. And so she was like, really, people, I don't have any reason to make this up. And I'm not going to, there's nothing for me to debate with you. I've been followed in stores my whole life, and I'm in my 40s, and I know when someone is following me, and I know when it's about safety and security. And hello, you don't live in this body and this experience. And it was, I can kind of smile about it now, but there was a lot of tension in the room at the time. And this person no longer felt safe to even talk about her experience as a Black woman in this mixed race group. And as far as I know, to this day, has not been engaged in another conversation with any of the people who were in the room that day who said those kinds of things. So it's really difficult to recover once you make those mistakes, because you're working from your own biases, your own perceptions, and your own filters, instead of reaching across, building a bridge, accepting the other person's experience, perceptions, and filters as true, because in fact, they are true for them. So, how to have a productive relationship cross culturally, especially if you're talking about race. You want to remember that the other person's experience is exactly as valuable, equally as valuable as your own. You want to have a lot of curiosity, and you want to be able to put in check your own assumptions and stereotypes and biases. You also want to be willing to initiate the conversation if you are curious, and you may want to use current events or things that are being talked about in the media or a recent book that came out in order to have these kinds of conversations. So some of you are saying, okay, Tracy, I got it. I'm willing to have the conversation. I'm willing to invite someone, but I don't have any idea what to actually say once they say yes. Like deer in headlights, look, oh my goodness, they said yes. Now, what do I talk about? So I'm just going to share with you 10 examples of questions that open the door at different levels. So these 10 questions, I'm not going to share them in any particular order, but you may find one or two that really fit the situation that you are in, where you would like to have a conversation. You also may find that one or two of the questions are more effective for you when you're with a small group of 3 or 4 people rather than when you are one on one. And I'm going to share these 10, but I will also tell you that you can download the 10 as well. Um, and I'm going to get the link up for you so that you can download it now. So, let's see. I picked 10 of my most favorite. I have a list of about 40 questions that I like when I'm talking about or facilitating a conversation that is based on race, where I want to really find out how is race affecting you or impacting your life. So the first one is, when you were a child, what did you learn about racism? Now, we clearly, if I clearly have lots and lots of examples, because I grew up in a neighborhood that was changing racially. I went to an all Black school. I went to an almost all white school. I went to a Black high school. I went to an almost all white college. I've worked in lots of different environments. So I have a lot of examples, and going back to a child. But don't assume that because someone is white, they have no examples. That would be a wrong assumption. The question is, when you were a child, what did you learn about racism? It may be something they learned or that their parents or family said. It may be something that they just picked up in the media from watching TV. What did you learn? We learn things lots of different ways. There may have been an event that happened in their city or town or school that they remember that taught them something about racism. They may have grown up in the civil rights movement and saw the riots and, or saw um, on TV Martin Luther King marching. Or they could be a young person and they learned something about racism, based on something that just happened 10 years ago. So everyone, black, white, and every shade of color in between, has learned something. If they grew up in a different country, they still learned something about racism. So this is an example for all 10 of the questions, that they have to be written in such a way or spoken in such a way that there's no wrong answer, which is one of the tips from the any building any cross-cultural conversation. There's no wrong answer to, when you were a child, what did you learn about racism? So, question number 2, what feels important to you about race relations? Again, there's no wrong answer. I'm asking what in our community or what in the world feels important to you about this general topic that we are calling race relations. And I am intentional about using race relations, how the people from different race groups interact with one another often. I don't use racism all that often because, again, it depends on how people interpret that. But how we interact across races is something we all can have an opinion about. Question number 3, what pain or what concerns have you experienced as a result of racism in our society? So I'm using racism specifically to describe a pattern in our society. But the question is, what pain has that caused you, or what concerns do you have about it? Number 4, how does race-based violence affect you? Or how do you feel when race-based violence is featured in the news? Again, it's about your personal reaction, and that's going to tell me a lot, not because I want to judge you. It's just going to tell me a lot about how someone else is experiencing this phenomenon that's happening in terms of race-based violence. Last week, I was able to attend an event hosted by a nonprofit called World Without Hate. And I was so happy is not the word, but I was so encouraged that people were having a conversation about the race-based violence that happened after 9/11, where people whose skin were brown, who were immigrants or first generation, were targeted because there were people who felt we need revenge because people like you bombed the World Trade Center. And so we're going to kill you first, or we're going to attack you first. And it was totally based on race and religion, but people were being identified based on how they appeared, their racial identity appeared to those who were attacking them. So, how does race-based violence affect you? If it's a question you can ask everyone, and everyone has wisdom to share. Number 5, I want to take a stand for respect and positive race relations. What suggestions do you have for me? Number 6, what, in your opinion, are examples of racism in our country or in our city today? Number 7, do you think we pay too much attention to race and ethnicity, or not enough? And of course, then you would follow up asking for some examples from that person's perspective so that you could understand their point they were making. Number 8, what kinds of things do you do to minimize the effect of racism in your life? And don't be surprised if someone says, I just pretend it's not happening. Don't jump on them for that. They're just being honest and sharing with you what they do. And sometimes when people share things like that and they say it out loud, they go, wow, I wasn't ever consciously doing that, but that is what I do. And I'm going to change that beginning today. Number 9, what advice would you give our teens and young adults about race, racism, or race relations? Great discussion can come from that. And number 10 is one of my favorites. Knowing what you know today, if you could go back in time, what advice would you give your 18-year-old self about race, racism, or race relations? These are questions you can use to have safe and productive conversations where you get to know someone and build a relationship across racial identity or ethnic identity. I hope this information has been really helpful for you. And I'd love to hear about how you use these questions in your own life. So feel free to stay in touch and share this information with others. You will receive a link to the replay, or if you're watching the replay, you have the link, and feel free to share it with others. And the 3 places that you can find me, depending on what our connection is you can absolutely find me on the Facebook group, What Is Mine to Do? You can find me at diversity-strategy.com, or the easiest one, tracybrown.com. That's it for today, and I hope it's been helpful. And until we connect again, have a great day.